first, let me just say what a great honor it is to be here. It's frankly very humbling to be among the crowd here, many of which you guys are the example of what made me want to join Special Forces when I was a younger man. And then the speakers are just inspirational so far. The opportunity to present this is really important to me because frankly, it's obviously very personal. I think it's a great story, but I also think it's largely still unknown in the SOCOM community. I travel around a lot. I used to do a bit of teaching with JSOW, and I just asked a friend of mine in the front row a question, and I'm still amazed how little the community really knows about what really happened. So I think this is a great opportunity that I'm really personally very excited about. So let me just kind of give you an idea of some promises I'm going to make, what I'm going to tell you in the next hour. I'm going to tell you some things that are going to make you really proud of the regiment. You're going to be inspired. If you're an SF guy, I would expect you're going to sit there and think, man, I wish I was a part of that piece. You're going to hear things that make you wish you were on that mission. You're going to hear some things that are going to make you say, how is it possible I don't know that? You're going to hear a couple of things that you're going to make you, I see you snucking, Dan, I saw you. You're going to ask, how did that really happen? That couldn't have really happened. And you might hear a couple of things toward the end that are going to make you go, that's really frustrating and almost makes me angry that that really happened. So if I don't achieve one of those for you, let me know later and I owe you a beer, but I'm pretty confident I will keep you entertained with enough stories laced in for the next hour. You can go to that first slide, Chris. So of course with all briefings, let me just give you a speck of context and bring us back. Normally with crowds, by the way, if you haven't done this, when I speak to people in uniform, I actually have to explain 9/11, not what it was, but I find out that many of them weren't alive. This crowd looks like most of you remember it as an actual event. Yeah. But that's actually important because when I used to give this pitch 15 years ago, it was personal. We all knew things. Now I realize we all don't. But right after 9/11, we were in a fairly unique place mentally. Things that we had tolerated for the better part of a decade were no longer considered acceptable. And I'm talking about specifically the condition in Iraq. Chris, does it advance? Can you go to the next one? Yeah. If you're not familiar, following the 1991 Gulf War, we sort of contained the threat from Saddam Hussein in Iraq for the better part of 10 years. And we did that by committing a significant amount of our military in the north, in the Gulf, and down south in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. He generally violated sanctions or defied sanctions for the better part of that 10 years. Every time he violated those sanctions, we usually responded with some sort of military show of force that was fairly, I don't want to say cost expensive to us, but it took a lot of resources. And then there was the question of, is he still working on his weapons of mass destruction? And again, it's very easy to look back now and come up with conclusions that we've been told, in the aftermath. But at the time, it was very concerning that he was still potentially holding on to or working on a weapons of mass destruction capability. Just simple rhetorical question. I'll give you the answer in a second. Does anybody know how many times Saddam Hussein used weapons of mass destruction? Now, again, rhetorical question. Some of you are like, yeah, I heard about that event. Okay, it's actually about 3 dozen. And I'm talking from 1980 to 1991. There's about 3 dozen incidents, and actually in military circles, he does hold, I'll say, the record for the most successful use of chemical weapons in warfare against the Iranians. There are several events he conducted that, as much as they were horrific, they were also incredibly effective in wiping out entire army units of the Iranian army. And then most famously in 1988, he used chemical weapons to crush the Kurdish resistance in the area of Halabja, and I'll talk about that. 5,000 civilians were killed. So that feeds into where our mindset was after 9/11. Now again, I just tell you this part of the story. Knowing we had just started in Afghanistan, there was a reality, understanding that we cannot go after al-Qaeda and all of their affiliates while we're still committing half of our military to contain this individual who appears to be problematic. That was the mindset. So the theory was, I'll say, relatively sound, that we are no longer going to tolerate that. We're going to remove that as a problem, solve it, and then we'll be able to move on with the other efforts. I say that because in the aftermath, I've heard a bunch of different stories about how we were trying to tie Saddam to al-Qaeda. That was never the case. It was clearly a military endeavor of, we can't continue to have half our military circling Iraq when we're trying to do something else. So I just want to basically quickly talk about the terrain, the enemy, and the general situation. These are 2 simple maps of Iraq. I suspect several of you have been there, but most of you probably have not. What you can see here is it's this border mountain area that I want to talk about first. Iraq is not all flat desert. It actually has a fairly significant mountainous area that I'll show you pictures of in a second. And this area here corresponds to this area here. There's two Kurdish factions. One's called the KDP, one's called the PUK. That's not particularly important at this point. But these are the two factions of the Kurdish, I'm going to say Kurdish resistance, that have habitually been a problem for Saddam Hussein. Just talking about them, the KDP is the more dominant one. It has about 30,000 fighters that they call Peshmerga. Peshmerga is a Kurdish term for one who faces death. And the PUK has about 22,000. So there's a significant amount of manpower, fighting manpower here that's been threatening Saddam Hussein for quite a while. Next slide, Chris. All right, so when I talked about those mountains, yep, that's them. That's what I'm talking about. That actually is the Iranian border. So it's Iraq on this side, and right over the ridge, it's Iran. It's about 10,000 feet. It looks a lot like the Rocky Mountain National Park. And then that's also what typical Kurdish fighters look like. Next slide, please. Okay, let's talk about the enemy situation. You're going to hear me also say a lot of stuff that, again, put yourself in that mindset of if this is your mission, you're going to hear a lot of stuff that it's not exactly ideal. Stuff that's really what we're dealing with. So in the wake of the Gulf War, Saddam lost a significant amount of his military. It was destroyed. In the current situation, he has 20 divisions at his disposal to still use to defend Iraq. 13 of those divisions are north of Baghdad. So as the U.S. military is starting to key up for an invasion of Iraq, it's super important to understand that 60% of his combat power is north of Baghdad. And this is the way it's arrayed. It doesn't really matter the names of them, but there's 13 divisions arrayed that way. 2 of them are Republican Guard divisions, and 1 is an armored division. Again, from a military perspective, that should note in the back of your head of, I'm concerned about those entities. There's also a weird little piece down here called the MEK, that stands for Mujahideen al-Khalq. These are Persian exiles that fled Iran after the fall of the Shah. It's a brigade-sized element, and I'll just explain it this way. If the Republican Guard was the elite that Saddam used to keep an eye on the military, the MEK is the elite that he uses to keep an eye on the Republican Guard. The theory of it is they have nowhere to go. They have no families in Iraq. They're not culturally or ethnically from Iraq. They're outsiders. So Saddam has some leverage over them. They're right down here somewhere. And now if you're like, oh, that's a pretty bad situation. There's this little thing over here, this little isolated pocket. That's the Iranian border area I just talked about. There is an extremist group there that is affiliated with al-Qaeda. It's called Ansar al-Islam. And it has about 1,000 fighters. It's entrenched in the mountains around the area of Halabja that I talked about, the historic area that saw the chemical attack in 1988. And we the U.S. government know that this extremist group is experimenting with biological and chemical weapons. That's the enemy situation. Is that bad enough for you? Next slide, Chris. Okay, just to give you a little more picture of the terrain, as you get away from the mountains and you're looking west, that's what it looks like. It's extremely rolling terrain. It looks sort of like the Dakotas. And then if you get past that, it turns into this, which is what the rest of Iraq looks like. That's the Iraq everybody thinks of. That's not the Iraq we're dealing with in this scenario. I'm sorry, can you go back one, Chris? Yeah. I also wanted to point something out. You can kind of see it on this map. This is what's called the green line. The green line essentially is what we in military terms would call a flot or a FIBA. It's the demarcation line between the Iraqi forces and the Kurdish forces. Meaning, after the Gulf War, when Saddam lost so many of his forces, he had to pull back what military he had and defend the terrain he could hold. That green line represents that. Now, what that means is, it's where the mountains and the rolling hills stop. It's not for any particular reason other than the terrain becomes harder to defend if the Iraqi forces go into the hills, because then the Kurdish guerrillas can attack them. So that's what's caused the green line to grow up where it is. Historic Kurdish territory actually goes a bit beyond that green line. And it encompasses the two main cities in the north. There's going to be a test on this, by the way, so you need to pay attention. It encompasses the 2 main cities in the north, Kirkuk and Mosul. If anybody's a religious history buff, just to let you know, Kirkuk is the burial site for Daniel from Daniel of the Lion's Den, and Mosul is where Jonah from Jonah and the Whale's from. And I just tell you that is when you're in Kirkuk, there's a huge monument to where Daniel's buried. Apparently, if you get thrown into a lion's den and don't get eaten, it's a big deal that people remember. And it's not regarded as a Christian thing or a Jewish or Muslim. It's regarded as the guy who was thrown into the lion's den and didn't get eaten. And that's in Kirkuk. It's really, really interesting. Iraq's a great country, actually. But I tell you this also because the oil industry for Iraq is half based out of the north. It's predominantly in the space between Kirkuk and Mosul. So Saddam needs this. He needs that, particularly if he's going to lose the south. How does he retain a country that has some viability? He does it by having still an oil revenue capacity in those oil fields. Okay. Okay, go back to the next slide, Chris. Next. All right, so that's the friendly enemy and terrain situation. I know that's a lot to throw at you, but I just want to give you some of that context. I also want to talk about what was going on at CENTCOM and the U.S. forces at this time. As I said, keep in mind, Mark Rosengart is in the mountains of Afghanistan doing what he's doing right now. You know, the U.S. government is fighting a war in Afghanistan, and it's not going as good as it was going 3 months ago. It's starting to concern us. So the bulk of CENTCOM's real bandwidth is fighting that war. But now we've also decided we're thinking about going to war here too. So I'm going to just tell you, half the CENTCOM staff is focused on this war. And I'm talking about, this is the springtime of 2002. There is a written war plan for this thing, and it's called 1003 Victor. And it was written 15 years prior, so it doesn't make any sense. It talks about a military with 30 divisions that we don't have. So as much as there was a written plan, CENTCOM now realizes that's not going to work. So they come up with another plan, and that plan was called Running Start. And this plan was great. It was going to be super fast and super light and not nearly enough forces to do what we needed to do. Now, I say this way because we're not abandoning, this is all true, we're not abandoning the 1003 Victor plan. Half the CENTCOM staff is going to continue to work on that plan, even though we know it's not viable. But now I'm going to pull off some of that staff to work on the Running Start plan that I think is a really good idea, but we also kind of know that's not viable either. They work on this for about 6 months, and there's massive arguing going on internal to U.S. channels that that's a ridiculous plan, it's not viable. So then they finally come up with the fourth plan, which is called Hybrid. And it was a combination of Running Start and the original 1003 Victor plan. So there are literally 4 different planning groups working in CENTCOM, breaking up the manpower into force to do this planning. That's important to understand because I'm just going to tell you the planning was not spectacular. To my knowledge, CENTCOM never produced an actual order that we as a subordinate got, and subsequently our SOCCENT also didn't produce a subsequent order. If you're not a former military person, I will just tell you that's a big deal. It's really hard to be effective if you haven't gotten a plan from your higher headquarters. Go to my next slide. Okay. Actually, I'm sorry, back up one. I'm going to hold that for a second. You don't need to hear about this quite just yet. So I give you this background. It's a really, really fluid environment. It's really, really challenging and confusing. So in the summertime of 2002, we started to get indications that this is for real. We at least got a warning order from our various higher headquarters to start considering this. Now, I'm glad to see there's a handful of veterans from this operation in the room. You will remember, we always were told off to the side, it's going to happen next month. Does anybody else have scar tissue from that still? We were usually told it was going to be next weekend. It's this weekend. We got told that from August till about February. It was, and I can joke about it now. It's extremely painful to keep telling soldiers and their families it's going to be this weekend, and to do that for 30 weeks, and then also trying to plan out what you're going to do. So I tell you these things because now I'm going to take this down to a single battalion. I was debating what stories I'm going to talk about. We call this Task Force Viking. I know I got at least one. Any veterans in the room that were actually at the group headquarters, just SOTF level? All right, great. I can talk bad about them then. It's the nature of the beast. As a lower unit, you're always going to have some issues with your higher. We weren't actually called Task Force Viking. None of us called ourselves Task Force Viking. That name materialized during the operation toward the end. So it was very weird. And it still is weird for me when people are like, oh, Task Force Viking. We were called just SOTF North. You know, and God bless the just SOTF staff in the group. They came up with all these Viking names for things that were really, really cool, and none of us knew what they were talking about. I can remember the day where they said to us, hey, you need to come to the meeting at Low-Key Base. We had no idea what that was. And we're like, you mean Erbil? That's a city name. And they're like, yeah. They had all these really cool names, and it just kind of gave you a weird feeling of, see, you guys have been working hard up at the just SOTF. But I tell you that is about, that was a group thing that never really materialized internal to the force. But here's the group's plan. The group's concept is we're going to have 3 battalions in this task force. It's going to be 2nd Battalion from the 10th, 3rd Battalion from the 10th, and 3rd of the 3rd. We couldn't get 1st of the 10th. And I'm always going to use people's actual rank at the time. I hope Major General Roberson gets to come back in here. Colonel Cleveland was the JSOTF commander and the 10th Group commander. And he actually did an amazing job, frankly. But he tried really, really hard to get 110, and I use the term, he got shot in the face several times. That UCOM was not going to relinquish it and didn't want to hear it again. So you're getting 3rd of the 3rd as your round out battalion. I'm just going to tell you that wasn't a great fit for a bunch of reasons. We didn't know them, they didn't know us, we didn't understand their capabilities, we didn't come up with good missions for them, and the 2 units never really meshed, so that was just a bad fit. We also were given M Squadron of the SBS, the British SBS, and we were given them specifically to conduct a raid on a specific site that I'm going to talk about. So that's basically the force package that we had. The mission starts to materialize where we know we're going to conduct unconventional warfare. And we know there's 2 factions. If you think back to that original map, there's the KDP and the PUK. So we kind of know it's 1 battalion apiece is going to work with those 2 factions to promote resistance, to cause problems for the northern front. What we didn't do is actually focus on the whole JSOA. The group is responsible for all the terrain all the way up to the Syrian border. So I tell you this, I wish Mark Rosengard was still in the room. One of the comments he made earlier, we were talking about mission statements and the mission to conduct UW. As a former instructor in me, I'll just tell you, it's dangerous to use wording like that because when you start quoting a type of operation as the task, that becomes the task, to do that type of operation, not to have an effect. Our mission wasn't to conduct unconventional warfare. Our mission was to disrupt the Iraqi combat power in the north. We thought we would do it by conducting unconventional warfare. But we also thought we'd do it by having RAP patrol teams run around the west, harassing enemy formations where they could. So that's just a really, really important point of way that mission statements can kind of get away from forces and you can start to get locked in on types of operations. I will just say this, I don't want to talk too much about like JSOTF South, which became JSOTF West, and 5th Group in the South, and SOCCENT, but there was a lot of emphasis almost on like looking at what we did in the Gulf War and saying, let's do the same stuff. Scud hunting became a huge topic of discussion for 5th Group. There was no Scud requirement. Scuds were not a threat in this conflict, but there was a tremendous amount of mental bandwidth about going after Scuds. So I just tell you, it's an example of we need to be precise in our terminology, and we generally were. I'm also just going to say this, I'm not going to talk about the SBS portion too much, but if anybody's familiar with Bravo 2-0 during the Gulf War, if you're not, talk to one of the people next to you, nod in their head. It was a huge bit of a fiasco event during the Gulf War. Much like sequels to all good movies, it's a bigger plot, it's just, greater action scenes. This was like that. They decided to infiltrate into the Western Desert without actually telling the JSOTF, and they were going to do some RAP patrol stuff. It went really, really badly. So I'm not going to harp on that, but it was exactly like a sequel to Bravo 2-0. So that's the SBS portion to JSOTF North. Okay. So having said that, let me just keep moving on. The group was struggling because SOCCENT and CENTCOM didn't really give them a plan. So subsequently, they didn't exactly solidify a plan either, which was really problematic. We made a decision in at least 3rd Battalion to write an order and issue it to our subordinates. And I'm saying that with a bit of caution. It's very, very easy for higher commands to rationalize that they don't need to do the same things we always tell our subordinates to do. It's very easy to rationalize, like the world is different up here, it's complicated, it's so complex, I don't have to give 1/3 of, 1/3, 2/3 of my time to subordinates to plan. In the real world, there's tons of that. Everybody was doing that. We didn't do that. We made a decision that we're going to write an order, we're going to give guidance, and we're going to let our teams have time to actually plan. So in July, and I should point out, I forget you don't know these things, I was actually the operations officer for the battalion. Lieutenant Colonel Tovo, now retired General Tovo, that you guys will hopefully hear Saturday speak, was the battalion commander. We made a decision to write a plan. We told our ODAs, you've got 4 weeks to do whatever training you want to do, and then you're going into isolation planning. For some of you older guys, we meant old school style isolation, and I'll talk about that in a second. I've seen, as an instructor, I've seen probably 100 isolation planning events. And I've always been frustrated with the forces, lack of clarity in how this goes. In the schoolhouse, it's not uncommon for visitor briefback takers to treat teams like stump the chump or thinking, I'm going to pick your course of action. We didn't do that. And this is, in my opinion, one of the most important points about our success. Tovo and I have a very, very similar mindset about this process. We treated the teams like we know them, which we did. They were our subordinates. There was no question if they're ready, if they're good enough. They're ours. You know, if they weren't good enough, I should have said something about it yesterday, not suddenly today there's a real world mission. So we did sit down, we actually talked about the teams, we rated them all, 1 to 15. We only had 15 ODAs in a battalion back then. And we divvied out who we thought we should go on what missions. There was 100% confidence in our teams. We didn't have to do like a little tryout or anything like that. We put the teams into, if anybody's familiar with Fort Carson, we have a really kick-ass isolation facility, which we deliberately chose not to use because it's 100 meters from the group headquarters. And it has a whole bunch of other stuff occupying rooms because you can't just keep a gigantic isolation facility empty for decades. So it had like a gymnasium in there, it had the mountain locker, had an Irish pub. It does. So we made the unpopular decision to actually drive out to Pinyon Canyon, which is a 3-hour drive one way from Fort Carson, and there is nothing out there. I mean, it is tar paper shacks that have, barely electricity and barely running water. And the teams all complained about this, like, why are we doing that? Why are we doing that? After we did it, everybody came back and said that was the right thing to do. Now, I'll also say, we put 3 companies through the isolation planning, 1 company a month. That was what we could handle. Tovo and I drove from Fort Carson the 3 hours one way on Tuesday and Friday of every one of those weeks. When we would get to Pinyon Canyon, we would spend 10 hours, 2 hours per ODA, talking with them about their mission. And again, this sounds you probably want to hear more about firefights and stuff like that, but it was critical that we sat down with teams and we didn't act like it was an audition. We picked their brain and said, do you understand what I'm asking you to do? And more often than not, half the teams were unclear. And we got to a point where they really, really understood what was important to us. And we worked through their mission statement and we got them to just really be in a good place. Obviously, it goes without saying that Tovo and I were utterly exhausted after doing, 16-hour days twice a week for 3 weeks. But at the end of it, we had complete confidence in our teams. And this is going to be really important later because you're going to see what we're going to do in terms of how we decentralized cutaway teams and said, call me when you can, which I don't think is very common. I don't think it's actually happened since. So we put everybody through the isolation planning. And I really stress, we treated them like they're the commanders of we're giving you a mission. I had one team, and you're going to hear this number again, 8-1. It's one of our really, really good teams. Did some great stuff. Worst briefers I've ever seen. Not a lot of uniform guys in here. Colonel Round, who just gave up 10th Group about a year ago, he was the team leader. Worst briefers I've ever seen. After the briefing, the team, about 3 guys on the team that I know, pulled me aside panicking, begging to still get the mission. And I laughed. I was like, what are you guys talking about? Yeah, you're going. I'm not sending you to brief, thank God. I know you I know you guys enough. I know you know what to do. Your briefing skills suck, by the way. But that's the relationship we have with our teams. So that was really, really important. So we got through isolation, and we still, again, going back to what I said, we always thought it's next week. We're leaving in a week. So it was really hard to figure out what do you do with your time. We did a lot of pre-mission training, stuff that you probably wouldn't think about. We did live tissue training on goats. We did some close air support training. We did media ambush training. We drove to Fort Leonardwood so we could go into a live chemical agent chamber, which is the most anticlimactic training you could possibly imagine. If you've ever been to Fort Leonardwood, that's not very exciting in itself. But imagine this. This is like the best of all worlds. A 16-hour one-way bus ride to go to Fort Leonardwood, to put on NBC equipment, to then go into a room that, frankly, I don't know if there's anything in this room or not. None of us died, but I really don't know if it was just an empty room that they're like, tell them there's nerve agent in there. You stand there for a half hour moving around, then we come out, and you get to take the NBC equipment off again, and then get back on the bus. That's good training. Soldiers were excited about that. But that's the kind of stuff we were doing. I joke about it, but that's the kind of stuff we were trying to make use of our time. We put everybody through 2 weeks of language school. everybody went to either Arabic, Turkish, or Kurdish. Now you might think 2 weeks isn't much. Yeah, that's right, it's not. You know what the difference between nothing and 2 weeks is? It's massive. Nothing is nothing. 2 weeks allows you to do the pointy, talky, and walk your way through rudimentary instructions. We did that for every guy, and that was a big moneymaker for us. I had to go to CENTCOM a couple of times. I went to CENTCOM in Tampa, and I had to go to CENTCOM in Qatar to talk about the plan. And I want to point this out because it's relevant to the overall mission again. When I came down to CENTCOM, I was in the room with all the CENTCOM planners, and a debate broke out about what is our mission. And I don't mean me, 10th Group. I mean us, like the mission, for CENTCOM. And there was a question about, is the mission to remove Saddam Hussein or remove his WMD capability? And a sergeant major in the room, who was from RCENT, which is the Army component for CENTCOM, said, hey, sir, that's way above our pay grade. That's not for us to debate. And I literally said to him, I was like, what are you talking about, sergeant major? There's nobody else. Like, this is it. This is the last. There's not another room with smarter people in it. And that was really important to understand, that CENTCOM wasn't particularly clear on why are we doing this? Like, it started to get mixed up in old mission statements, like from the Gulf War. Then we went out to Qatar, and I was telling Chris about this earlier. This is just the soft people, the SOCCENT people. We all met in Qatar for a gigantic rock drill, a very NTC-style rock drill. Okay, in your brains, you should be like, wow, that doesn't sound like an appropriate thing to do for special operations. Absolutely correct. It made no sense whatsoever that the Navy SEALs that are going to go seize GoPlats in the south of Basra need to hear me brief about my mission in the north of Iraq. And this was an example of, we're doing Army things that we learned somewhere that are good for the Army. They're not special operations things. And it was the most ridiculous drill, standing around reciting our mission for people. Like, I'm potentially going into enemy territory. I should not hear what the Navy SEALs are going to be doing down south, and what night it's kicking off. That was so this all ties again together, that we were not clear on what we were doing. And SOCCENT at that time particularly demonstrated they had no visibility. They had no visibility what JSOC was planning, and they were very unclear about what we were planning. Meaning, from their perspective, they were like, you guys are just going to do UW. And I stress again, that's not really accurate. We were there to disrupt the enemy. And I promise I'm going to get off the planning stuff and actually talk about the operation here in a second. They kept using the word fix. They kept saying, yeah, you guys are going to fix the enemy in the north. Chris, can you go back to the enemy slide? Okay, this is the kind of stuff, if you ever happen to find yourself planning an invasion, which it could happen. I didn't think I was going to be planning an invasion before 9/11. I want to point out, so let's say we're here, right? This is where the U.S. forces are. These are the forces we're talking about. The more I studied the enemy situation, the more I started to understand what Saddam was thinking, and it actually made a lot of sense. And this is really important. I don't want to screw the way I'm explaining this up. Saddam's plan is these are the two Republican Guard divisions. He needs to be able to retain flexibility to counterattack south with these. He doesn't care about these. So frankly, we could kill all of them as long as we don't interfere with the Nebuchadnezzar and the Adnan divisions. He achieves his objectives. And I think the American mindset was very frontal attack killing, where we're like, we're going to just kill a whole bunch of these guys. And the question comes up, are you going to kill enough of them that you'll be able to stop the ones on the back from going south? And I mean, I don't know if this will resonate, but I explain it this way. When you're looking at a map, it's two-dimensional. When you're actually on the ground, it's not two-dimensional, it's like this. And what I'm saying is, you are the American forces, you're touching this edge of the paper. You're trying to have an effect on this edge of the paper. So suddenly it becomes evident that it's not just about killing and attacking, it's about having an effect. That effect has got to be to compel Saddam from not moving his forces south. I hope you can follow this. I can't force him to not go south. And the military word fix in military lingo implies I can pin him down with fire and force him from not going south. This is important for CENTCOM because I'm not physically in a position to fix him. I have to compel him. So how do you compel somebody to do something? I have to threaten him in a way that makes him afraid to move these guys south. And I go back to, I can kill all of his forces, and he's actually fine with that. What he's not fine with is if I take Kirkuk and Mosul. Because if I take Kirkuk and Mosul, he loses the oil. I tell you this from the strategy perspective, this was lost on CENTCOM. They were like, yeah, go do your special ops thing, UW, whatever you call it, fix the enemy. And these are really, really important discussions because it's going to have bearing on the timing and how we're going to do things. I will also say this, the group also misunderstood this, and the sectors they gave us ended at the green line. So again, from a military perspective, I want to make sure you understand this. I'm giving you a task to have an effect outside of the sector I'm giving you on forces that you can't reach. That's your task. That's really important to understand. I'm so glad, yeah, that's the way I felt about it too. Okay, so let me keep going. So I think I've set the stage for this is going to be really easy. This is going to be a pretty straightforward mission. In the early summer, the CIA came to us and they told us they were reestablishing contact with the Kurds. And I'll just say it this way. Our relationship with the CIA in this particular operation could not have been better. I got nothing but affection for those guys. They were fantastic partners. I talked about the two Kurdish factions. We had a presence in northern Iraq up till 1996 from the Gulf War on. If any of you recall, at the end of the Gulf War, we conducted Provide Comfort, sort of setting up refugee safe havens for the fleeing Kurds. The Kurds, by the way, all remember President Bush sort of implying you guys should take matters into your own hands, which they did, because they thought we were going to be behind them, and we weren't, and it went really, really badly for them. And that's kind of what then perpetrated the further refugee crisis. So the Kurds all kind of remembered that we sort of let them down. In 1986, sort of the same thing happened. From the Kurdish perspective, it's reasonably well documented. The CIA operatives on the ground said, you guys should conduct a coup and an uprising, which they did, and it went extremely badly. There was a bit of a scandal if that was ever a sanctioned coup by the U.S. government or not. The CIA operatives say it wasn't. That's a different story. But the bottom line is the U.S. kind of panicked, and we withdrew all forces from northern Iraq that were there doing their CIA business, but we were also there in a monitoring relationship with the Kurds. We actually evacuated what was called the Zaku House in 1996. The Kurds were freaked out because they knew we're overreacting. The young team leader that evacuated the house was a Captain Pat Roberson. Okay, for most of you in the room that don't make the connection, I'm talking about Major General Roberson that was sitting here earlier today. He was the last captain in Iraq in 1996. So this is actually important. Now the CIA is telling us they're going to go back in and reestablish these contacts. And they want us to send guys with them, a term we used as a pilot team. We had a bunch of guys that we had detailed to the agency for Afghanistan already. They already told us, hey, we want the same guys. Sergei's sitting here, he's one of them. And it was an easy, done deal that each battalion had one team of 6 guys pre-identified and trained as a pilot team, 6-6 and 7-6, that went to the agency, detailed with them, and now is going to be a part of that pilot team effort. The CIA went back in July. Our pilot teams joined them on the ground in, I think, October, November. And that was really, really critical to our planning, to have guys on the ground talking to the Kurdish leadership, sending information back. So here's how, everything I just explained to you is what we knew. Here's how we now got the Kurdish perspective of, are they interested in this plan? Basically, it's like a used car salesman, and I'm talking about my pilot team leader, Andy Grunland, who I've known, for 10 years before this from my time in Stuttgart. Basically, the Kurds, the question was, hey, we want to go fight Saddam. Are you guys interested? I know I've let you down a few times before, but this one's for real. And the Kurds were like, hey, that sounds great. We'd love to do it. The problem is, I got this problem in my rear area called Ansar al-Islam that's actually the bigger threat. And also, by the way, since 1996, we kind of been in a brutal civil war with our Kurdish faction here. So for example, of my 22,000 fighters, 10,000 of them are here, 8,000 of them are here, and the remaining old men are men in this line. So, I'd love to go fight the Iraqis with you, but I kind of got a couple other things going on. So the pilot team was then in a position to say, what's it going to take? What do I got to do to get you to go fight? This is exactly the way this went. What's it going to take for you to come and fight the Iraqis with me? And I joked about my pilot team. They're basically like, I'm going to write a figure on a piece of paper, sliding it across. And it was, when I got to talk to my pilot team leader, it was almost like, hey, good news. They've agreed to it. I'm like, that's great. What do we got to do? It's pretty simple. All we got to do is wipe out this hard entrenched fanatical faction up in the mountains. We wipe them out, and then they're good. I'm like, that shouldn't be an issue. Cool. So are you guys up for this? All right. That's the situation we're facing. At some point, the pilot team, which was detailed to the agency, was supposed to be sending their reports through other channels to get to me. Nothing was getting to me. Whether it's the agency, the Pentagon, the Joint Staff, CENTCOM, SOCCENT, group, someone between me and my pilot team thinks they know the answer better and is either not giving it to me or fixing the answer. When I finally talked to the pilot team in person the next time, they had sent me, like to me specifically, over 200 reports. I saw none of them. And there were numerous RFIs that we asked, like, what uniform are the Kurds wearing? We were told they're wearing DCUs. They're in fact wearing BDUs. Cool, that's good to know, because you'd look like a jackass if you show up in the wrong uniform and they're all in BDUs and you're the only guy in DCUs. We asked if the airfield in the PUK territory was viable. We were told no, it's all cratered. That's incorrect, it's not cratered. So I mean, there was a bunch of decisions that were really, really important in my planning that I'm getting the opposite of the accurate information, and through a roundabout way, I eventually found out that the pilot team wasn't getting the stuff through. One of the pilot team members' daughter was sick. He had to be emergency extracted because she had to have brain surgery. So while he was in Colorado Springs, we argued for a week with the various levels of command if I could talk to so-and-so. And the answer was no. He's involved in a compartmented operation, and you're not cleared to know what he's involved in, which I knew what he was involved in. It was kind of ridiculous. 1 hour before he left for the airfield, we just decided enough is enough, and I went and talked to him, and he answered 100 of my questions, and then we coordinated a new method for communicating on an Iridium cell phone where I would just talk to them directly and we would start getting our questions answered. That was critical to our success. It was a game changer. Shouldn't have been that way, unfortunately, though. One other thing I'll tell you about the pilot team, and then I'll keep moving on. The pilot team on the ground, the situation was really, really desperate for the Kurds, particularly with this entity called Ansar al-Islam. They had recently conducted an operation where they lost a piece of key terrain, and they lost a significant, think in your head, the 5 best generals you know in the American military. Now imagine if all of them were killed next week in an operation. That's kind of the way this was. They had lost their top generals in this attack. It was really, really brutal. Out in the hinterland by the Iranian border, they have these man-made hills that are like 300 feet tall called Gordis. That's the Kurdish term for them. And they're ancient forts that's how they control the terrain. They lost one of these to the Ansar faction. In an effort now to retake it, their generals were killed in this attack because they don't have enough ammunition, they don't have the resources they need. During the attack, 3 members of the pilot team, one of them sitting right there, did some incredibly heroic stuff and alleviated the pressure against the Kurdish fighters by directing fire from the single artillery piece that the Kurds had. And they significantly exposed themselves to fire to do this. And it's did I describe that correctly?
It was a 25-pounder, and we happened to, well, it's a luck thing.
Close enough?
Ansar al-Islam decided to visit the troops, their leadership, and we just happened to fire for effect when they were visiting.
Yeah. But this is the kind of stuff, though, and if you're all wondering, man, where's that guy? What country is that guy from? This is the kind of thing, though, that the pilot team built immediate credibility and rapport with the Kurds. We have failed on 10 other promises to come through, but we started to build credibility on our presence. I am committed, I'm here with you, and I'm fairly competent in battle. I can be value added. That was a really, really important event. So as we're struggling with this back at Fort Carson, we're trying to figure out what we're doing. We don't know if we're going, we're working on the plan, we're going to PMT. An opportunity arises, and it's another compartmented opportunity. It's for 1 ODB and 6 ODAs, 3 from each of the 2 battalions, are going to go forward to Europe and do some kind of train-the-trainer program where we're going to pull people out of country and train them up on anti-tank missiles. That mission fell apart, but the ODB that was tagged to do it was now Major Pat Roberson. Again, for those of you that aren't connecting the dots, former Captain Pat Roberson, now Major General Pat Roberson, and the 6 ODAs. But while in Stuttgart waiting to try to do this mission, there was an opportunity to accompany a diplomatic effort that was going to drive across the border from Turkey and go visit the Kurdish leadership. So they basically passed themselves off as a security detail for this delegation. And they got on a bus and they drove across the border and never came back. The Turks figured it out and they stopped the 6th team from crossing the border, 095. Which then came home to us very disappointed. But we now have 2 pilot teams in country and 5 ODAs and 1 ODB. And this is about, let's say, January. This is also really important because I think the community The conventional and the soft community both think we infiltrated the night before and made magic. They don't understand the commitment of you got to assume some risk if you want to reap some benefits. So once we got these guys on the ground, it made a huge difference. We were starting to show a little bit more presence. Returning back to Fort Carson, there's a series of things that are hard to believe really happened. Again, I can't get into all of them, unfortunately, at a time, but the biggest one that happened was Turkey started to get cold feet. Sakir had done a great job of infiltrating equipment and buying us Land Rovers in Europe, 6 at a time, so it wouldn't create a giant signature. And they eventually pushed all of that equipment to Diyarbakir, Turkey. We also rebuilt the airfield for the Turkish military. So now imagine 300 Land Rovers have been shuttled to Turkey. All of our heavy equipment, all of our heavy weapons, a bunch of ammunition is all stockpiled in Turkey. And then Turkey breaks the news to us that they're really feeling uncomfortable about this and they'd rather not participate. And we can't use their airspace. This is a problem. So Sakir turns to, this is how this really happened. Sakir quickly turns to all the Eastern European countries, basically with a, who wants to be a part of NATO? And actually the first country that said, you can use our country to invade Iraq was Poland, which, thank you very much for that kind offer. We're looking for something a little bit closer than Poland. This is how it really happened. And we settled on Romania. Romania raised its hand and said, you can launch your invasion from our country. So we agreed on Constanta, Romania. Now, some of you may be like, I'm not that good at geography. I wasn't aware that Romania borders Iraq. It does not. It's actually, remember before I was like, hey, all you gotta do is just conduct a frontal attack in daylight up in mountainous terrain. It shouldn't be that big of a deal. The infill is basically the same. It's just 1,000 miles farther. And I should point out, the original plan for infiltration was all of the 2nd Battalion teams are going to drive across the border, and 3rd Battalion is going to drive half of its teams and fly half of its teams. Now we're in a situation where everybody would have to fly. That's significant because we don't have enough aircraft. And there's also a question of you can't do this over multiple nights because the Iraqis will figure it out, and the 2 airfields that we do have are technically within maximum rocket artillery range for the Iraqi forces. These 2 airfields, by the way, were built in 1988 by Saddam to continue to push the Iran-Iraq war. The war ended. So there are 2 airfields that have never had an aircraft land on them. And that's what the pilot team is working out. And as an example, when I say the pilot team did great stuff for me, one of the things they figured out was, can an American C-130 land on this airfield? And if you have all these cool notions of, yeah, those guys will land on a farmer's field. No, they won't. They won't. And we did all the testing required to determine that the runway is missing 1 inch, 2 inches of asphalt. So we worked with the Kurdish partners and said, hey, who put the asphalt on this runway? To which some local Kurdish guy was like, I did. We're like, again, what would it take to add 2 more inches of asphalt? And I mean, that's how it happened. So the pilot team actually refurbished the airfields for me so we can now land aircraft. That's the plan. But we're in Romania, and we got to try to figure out how we can still get from Romania into country. So again, it's getting to the point where we're pretty confident we're going to war, but there's still this kind of on and off. We're not sure. Colin Powell, if you all recall, came on the floor of the UN, said a whole bunch of stuff. One of the things he said that was actually, there's a bunch of things, most people don't remember this. He said Saddam has one more chance. Ooh, that was a bad thing to say. Because the Iraqis were ready to rise up, and then they heard that. Like, one more chance? What do you mean one more chance? Rumsfeld came on and basically did a Robert De Niro impression and was like, he's dead. His family, dead. And, no, serious. And the Kurds love that. And we actually sent that back. We actually sent that back in a report saying, and this is Kurdish language, they were like, the black general is scaring us when he says he has one more chance. We like the other guy. But those were real things. So it was really questionable, like, is this going to happen or not? Turkey now says, we're out. And if you wouldn't know this, but the United States was also planning on 4th Infantry Division coming through Turkey to attack from the north. It would appear there's a good chance the entire northern front is off the table. From Saddam's perspective, this is exactly what he wanted. He's going to be able to fight a one-front war with the majority of his forces back so he can counterattack, and I would speculate Saddam's plan was he'll lose the south, reposition from Baghdad, probably to Tikrit as his alternate capital, and then he will bloody the American forces very, very badly, and then he'll sue for some kind of negotiated peace. It's a pretty good plan, and he's making it work by doing what he does best. Like, he convinced Turkey it's not in your interest to do this. He's now reaching out to the 2 Kurdish factions and saying, you guys should reconsider your support to the Americans. and much like the Joker in Batman basically says, I have room for one Kurdish faction in my new country. Discuss amongst yourselves who it's going to be. And actually, the KDP answered, we're interested. The PUK, awesome, was like, no way, we're all in, you're dead. So, I mean, but this is what we're dealing with our faction. So it was really, really tenuous. So Colonel Cleveland had this great idea to demonstrate commitment to the Kurdish alliance, and maybe we had one more chance to infiltrate some other people. So we decided from Romania, hey, let's infiltrate the 2 battalion commanders and the 2 ops officers. To which, you know, I remember in my head thinking, I was like, okay, act like it's no big deal. All right, cool. Tonight, we're going tonight? Yeah, C-130? That sounds good. We went in the next day, and the sort of joke was that, you know, we need to send somebody with some rank that it's serious enough that they know we're committed, but not somebody who, well, you know, if we lost them, it wouldn't be the end of the world. Grab me tonight for a beer, I'll tell you the rest of that story. Like, my crazy infiltration story is a whole separate deal of how bizarre that was. But the bottom line is we flew to Turkey. From Turkey, we drove across Turkey. CIA actually transported us across Turkey to the Iraqi border. And we kind of knew when we got to the border, the Turks are going to probably arrest us for espionage to make a point to the U.S. We all joked that we were going to be, we all joked that we were going to a Turkish prison. When we got to the border, the Turks did exactly what we expected they were going to do. They started rooting through our equipment. They started arguing with us. And 2nd Battalion's pilot team was right there in their cars. There's a bridge crossing the Euphrates River, or Tigris River, excuse me. And there was almost a question of, if we were to just cross the bridge, would they chase us? So while they were arguing, and the CIA personnel, who were logistics personnel, were great. They played their role perfectly, tying up the border officers. The 4 of us just grabbed our rucksacks and basically slipped across the border, got in the pilot team's cars, which were all family cars, and we just drove away. And later we know the Turks lost their mind. We all joked that our faces were on the back of Turkish milk cartons. And I'm actually glad to say I was in Turkey 3 months ago for the first time, wondering if I was going to get arrested in the airport. Because we kind of knew, like, right now we can't go out through Turkey. Like, they will arrest us. And they did close the border to all other, that sealed it, that they're out, incursions are not happening. But now the 4 of us are in country. And we linked up with Major Roberson. We connected with our 2 Kurdish factions, KDP and PUK, and we had, by all accounts, what was exactly like every G-Chief meeting you've ever seen in the Robin Sage, you know, that first meeting. We were totally exhausted. We've been driving all night. We linked up with them, and now we start to talk. And it was good, and the PUK in particular were really, really good. During that meeting, one of the team guys came in and said, and it was really interesting, it was Tim Fuller from A2, whispers in my ear, I just want to make you aware, there appears to be Iraqi jets flying over our head. I'm like, good to know, good to know. And it was 2 Iraqi jets buzzing over our location. One of the team guys kind of sort of freaked out, and it was a case of, look at the Kurds, they're cool. And they're like, oh, they do this all the time. Don't worry about it. And frankly, from my perspective, I was like, oh, thank God we've got nothing outside like a Humvee or something stupid that would imply, you know, Americans are here. So that was kind of interesting. We threw on some Kurdish uniforms, and they insisted on taking us to the front. By front, I mean the Ansar area by the Iranian border. You got to see this. Come on. And again, we haven't slept in like 36 hours. We're totally exhausted. And we put on Kurdish uniforms. We drive to the front. It's about a 2-hour drive to that front. When we get there, I'll show you a picture in a minute. When we get there, we go into a building to meet the Halabja commander. It's a good meeting. We're talking about what we want to do, the frontal attack we're planning on conducting in about a week. You know, it all sounds really good. We walk out of the building, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to make, these are stupid analogies, but has everybody ever seen the movie The Jerk with Steve Martin? Yeah, it's an older crowd. You know the scene where there's a sniper shooting at the soda cans, and he's kind of looking at him like, these cans are defective. You always remember the first time somebody rockets you. We stepped outside. There's probably 1,000 Kurds in the street all milling about. And a Katyusha 107 rocket comes screaming from the hills. Now, I didn't realize it was a Katyusha 107 rocket at the time. And it smacked into a transformer on a telephone pole, which made a really twangy explosion sound. And I just remember when it did it, Tovo was right next to me. We both did this. We both were like, huh, that's weird. And we didn't make the connection of, yeah, it's a rocket. The second rocket came in and literally hit the wall of the building where we were just having the meeting, and it ripped right through the wall and devastated where we were all standing a minute ago. Everybody starts freaking out, running in all directions. We're jumping in these like rickety pickup trucks, and we all start now racing to. I'm really glad I didn't hit the deck. We all start racing to where the rockets are coming from. And I'm not sure if that was deliberate as much as like the Peshmerga privates driving the vehicles were told that's where we're going before the shooting started. So when we jumped in the vehicles and we're like, go, they're like, right. So now we're all racing at full speed to the area we're getting shot at from, which was really, really interesting because the whole time we're driving, mortar rounds are hitting on both sides of the road, but we're just still driving past it. We got past it. We got up to a lookout point to now observe the enemy positions, to which I kind of felt like, no, I got it. I know where they are now. And we had a really, really good perspective of, okay, here's what we're dealing with. Got it. Then we went back, returned, and we started to kind of like conduct what I would call normal FOB-like operations. So now, try to picture where we are. We've got the forces in country that I talked about. The situation is bad. We have not come through with the forces we promised. I don't think they're going to get here. They're stuck in Romania. We have not delivered any lethal aid to make them more powerful. We told them we were going to deliver them bags of money, which we have not. We told them there would be close air support to support their fight, which there is not. Because if Turkey's out, tactical close air support aircraft can't come. The only thing that can show up are B-52s or stuff off a carrier, which is like really, really limited. So we have failed in 5 of our 6 promises. It looks really bad. And I expect the invasion to start any day. So we're kind of freaked out that the majority of our forces are sitting in Romania, which, by the way, I got to point out, if you're an old 10th grouper, there was a psychological scar in 10th group before this that we had let these guys down. And I'm serious as a heart attack when I tell you this. When I got to 10th group in 95 as a team leader, it was very evident that people were still harboring significant emotional guilt from letting the Kurds down after the Gulf War. So there was a real emphasis of we've got a chance to make this right. Like from a 10th group credibility perspective. The guys are in Romania and they are chomping at the bit now because it looks like we're going to fail again. Really, really bad. On 19 March, the president authorized the shock and awe, the start of the shock and awe campaign. You've all heard that, but if you don't understand what happened, it literally was a surprise to everyone. I don't remember what triggered it. There's some event, but even CENTCOM didn't know. Like that wasn't the plan. So suddenly we were told attack. And even where we were, we got a message. I was at the CIA building, and we got a message direct from Secretary Rumsfeld, and it just said execute, 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 which was one of the few times I lost my temper because it was implying as if we were standing outside a door ready to attack the Ansar compound, which we obviously weren't. So we had to kind of calm down and be like, okay, we've got 40 guys in country, 40 American Green Berets, probably 20 to 25 CIA personnel. What are we going to do? So we talked about our plan and we broke it up as much as we could. We actually wrote a pretty good letter that it was like a telemarketing letter. You know, Dear General blank, we have deliberately selected you because of you are well thought of among the military and the Iraqi people. Iraq needs you right now, but time is limited. Act now. No, I'm serious. And we listed like 5 ways to get in touch with us because we kept thinking, like the Gulf War, everyone's going to want to surrender. We thought there would be mass surrenders. What we didn't realize was Saddam is doing an amazing job on his side applying the lessons learned to the Gulf War, making it clear, hey, if anybody thinks about surrendering, I'm going to kill you when I catch you, and I'm killing all your family, and I'm killing your neighbors too. So people were like, okay, surrender's not a good option. But we wrote this letter, we printed it in Arabic and English, on one on each side. We actually embossed it with the 10th group, like the notary 10th group thing, and we laminated it, and we gave it to underground contacts to deliver to various Iraqi commanders. I think our underground contact was killed. We also found out that something Saddam did, and again, you gotta Saddam's insanity is actually pretty amazing. He would call meetings with his division commanders, and to prevent any schemes from brewing amongst them, and this is the way it was described to us. Hey, let's start the meeting. Hey, I was just thinking, before we start, everybody get up and take the seat to your left. That's your new division. Literally, totally switched who's in charge of what divisions. And it totally screwed us up because we're sending letters to the 8th Division commander. The new 8th Division commander is like, hey, sir, just to let you know, Khalid got this letter from the Kurds yesterday. Yeah. It was really, really effective. And it was, in the same token, I said we were getting information from the underground on you got to be careful what you're saying on the UN floor. One of the other things we got that was super fascinating, and it's the way the Kurds would talk to us. They would, it's an Arabic thing too. They would be very polite. They would imply something. You have to see it and realize, do you want to tell me something? And they're going to be like, no, that's not my business. It's not important. No, you go and tell me. You don't want to know. No, I do want to know. Apparently, Arabic is a really tricky language. And the message the U.S. had been sending about surrender, what the Kurds told us was, why would you say it to them that way? We're like, I don't know what you're talking about, man. You need to be clear. It's just, we know you hate Iraqis. It just doesn't seem appropriate. I'm not going to get into your stuff. That's your business. And we really had to pull them. We're like, what is the issue? They're like, it's fairly disgraceful the way you're taunting them. Why would you use a woman's voice in the effeminate to ask them to surrender? Now, what's happening is here, as an American, we're just trying to be polite. That's being interpreted on the other side, because we're also not used to asking people to surrender. And you got to stop and think about this. By suggesting, I think you should consider, I would like you to consider surrendering. You understand where I'm going with this? There's the implication there that you strike me as the kind of guy that surrender would fit your lifestyle well. Versus, no, I'm serious, versus if I put a gun to, and I apologize, I'm looking at Alan because I know him. If I put a gun to your head and said, I think you should surrender, or I'm going to kill you, in the Arab culture, I have no choice. That's acceptable. As a man, I can accept that offer to surrender. But if you actually don't force me and you offer it to me, you're suggesting I'm a coward. And you do it with a woman's voice, and they were like, there's absolutely no way any man could accept that surrender even if they wanted to. We're like, ooh, that's good to know. We sent that back. We actually got a response from Condoleezza Rice thanking us for that feedback. We also, by the way, has anybody ever seen any pictures of Iraqi aircraft or tanks buried? Yeah, and the U.S. military is still like, we don't know why they did that. I can tell you why they did it, because apparently the word in Arabic for bury and abandon is similar, and we told them to bury their equipment, to which many of the Iraqis were like, we buried the plane. I don't know why you want us to do it, but we did it. True story. Okay, so staying on my script.
Mark, you're about
What's that?
10 minutes out.
Okay, gotcha. Go to the next slide. We didn't get surprised, but Colonel Cleveland had been brokering with CENTCOM to fly the force in on the 6 MC-130s, load them up to max, 19 ODAs, 3 ODBs, fly them from Romania to Jordan and across the border. Next slide. This is the route. Let me just ask, this is an actual question. How many of you have heard of Ugly Baby? Okay. This is actually, it's called Ugly Baby. That's the actual code name for the operation. 6 MC-130s cross the border. As soon as they get across the border, they're actually good for about an hour. They go into the Iraqi air defense belts and just start getting hammered. They're blacked out. They're flying at about 100 to 50 feet off the ground at full speed. This is what MC-130s were designed to do during the Gulf War. Or excuse me, not during the Gulf War, during the Cold War. What the Air Force guys from 352nd did was utterly amazing. One of the aircraft got hit 19 times. The picture in the upper left-hand corner is actually small arms bullets in the pilot's window. The 6 aircraft sort of made it, 3 to my airfield in the south, 2 to the airfield north of me, that one, and the 6th aircraft had to do an emergency divert landing up in Turkey, and basically did a controlled emergency landing. And that kind of freaked the Turks out. After that, the Turks opened up the airspace, and they were back in the game, and we infiltrated more teams in. When the teams landed on the blacked out runways, this goes to the thing I talked about in isolation planning. We didn't have any vehicles. We had family cars from Kurds. A team would get off the plane, eyes big as can be, and I would grab them, pull them off to the side, give them a 15-minute intel brief, and tell them what's going on, and say, look, here's the deal. You got 4 family cars here, or you got a school bus and a dump truck. Put your guys in there. The guy driving doesn't speak English, but I was here with an English speaker earlier this morning. He knows where to take you to your Kurdish commander counterpart. Here's my Iridium phone number. Call me when you can. Are you good? And guys moved out. This is critical because once we dispersed in my sector, I think it was 12 ODAs, once we dispersed the bulk of the ODAs, this was considered like the decisive point where Saddam couldn't disrupt us anymore. I'm not necessarily winning, but my ability to win is much better. Saddam can't stop me. He can kill me in the FOB tomorrow, but my ODAs are dispersed with their counterparts. We pulled this off in one single night. It was the most important event that we conducted. So now that we've done this, next slide. Now we are actually in business. We've got all of our ODAs and all of our ODBs in country. We've got them linked up with our Kurdish counterparts. We're just a little bit behind the power curve because the invasion technically started yesterday on the 19th. This is the 20th. We quickly take C Company and its 5 assigned ODAs. Don Bennett's here, he's a member of that company. And we push them out to the Halabja area where they are going to conduct this attack against Ansar al-Islam. Now I want to point out, I said Ansar al-Islam, I think I said 1,000. It's actually like 600 fighters entrenched in the mountains. The Kurdish plan that we have brokered with them is to have 10,000 Kurds attack it in 5 axes of advance going up into the mountains. It's going to be a daylight frontal attack in the mountains. Point out, this is a true fact that people think is weird. This is actually Colonel Tovo's map. See this, the blank spot? The United States government did not have coverage of Iran for maps in 2003. Yeah, you got to think about that one for a second. So this is the no-kidding map we are using. We are fighting here, we are fighting along the border, and we have no map coverage on the backside. But the bottom line is, this is the Sargat area where the chemical testing facility is, and this is a thing called Dargash Khan. It's where the foreign fighters are housed. Bottom line, we bombed this area intermittently because we didn't get the aircraft we needed for about 4 days. We kept that 4 days for the teams to actually meet their counterparts and plan and practice and rehearse. The day before the actual attack, we got a shipment of lethal aid, an influx of lethal aid, which was critical. The attack kicked off on the 26th. It was frankly, it was medieval. To watch where I was standing, I could actually see the bulk of the columns. I could see 5 1,000-person columns advancing across a large open field till they got to the foothills, and then the fighting would start. And the teams were able to utilize close air support and some other stuff that we had brought with us, like anti-tank weapons, CS grenades for clearing caves. We had brought a thing called APOBs. APOBs are backpack line charges for clearing minefields. I'll just tell you this quick one story, and then we'll start to kind of wrap it up a little bit. You take 2 backpacks, put them together, and it fires a charge out, and it clears a path in the minefield. One of the Kurdish young kids misunderstood that, and when we did it for real, blew a line through the field and said, let's go. Young kid got up and just charged, ran right into the minefield, blew up, and it was Jay Johnson that told me that story. He was like, the kid was all over me, just disappeared next to me as we're assaulting. This was an incredibly brutal fight. When the fight concluded that night, we had captured 8-1, that was the one that got to Sargat, had captured an Al-Qaeda suicide bomber whose vest didn't detonate. They captured him in a hand-to-hand fight. 9-4, that made it to Dargash Khan, got eyes on the foreign fighter training camp, and we got into a debate with the Air Force that they couldn't drop ordnance because they thought they were too close to the border. My rules of engagement, I could actually drop ordnance and pursue 5 kilometers into Iran. But we got into this big debate. All the foreign fighters are getting on trucks and driving into Iran, and we lost the opportunity. I will just tell you, you know that phrasing for the want of a nail, we lost the shoe, we lost the shoe, we lost the horse. Okay, foreign fighters. One of the foreign fighters that most likely was at that site was Zarqawi. If that name doesn't ring a bell to you, he became the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq that we hunted for a really long time, and Al-Qaeda in Iraq eventually became the forerunner to ISIS. So we had an opportunity to kill him, and we missed it because we misunderstood the rules of engagement. But the good news is, after this fight, and there's so much more I wish I could tell you about this fight that's really pretty amazing. The second day, it turned into a rout. We are just running, fleeing either prisoners or soon-to-be dead members all over the mountain space, and we're picking up weapons off the battlefield, and now we're taking 9,000 of the 10,000 fighters from this attack are now going to be repurposed to the Green Line. And we did this, and this is really, really important, we did this in time. You know, because CENTCOM started saying, hey, maybe we can put this off till after the invasion. They missed the point. This was meant to be done so that we could leverage it to the Green Line to prevent the Iraqis from dispersing south, and we pulled it off. Next slide. So now we are in the position to do what we came to do. Let's say it's 26 March. I just want to point out at this point, this is the night the 173rd parachutes into Bashur Airfield. Don't laugh. Bashur Airfield is 40 miles behind the Iraqi front lines in a safe direction. Just going to leave that one there for you. From our perspective, though, we now start to attack on the green line. We are now attacking with motivated, fired-up forces with equipment. The key to this picture I wanted to show you, this one, that's the green line. Those are Iraqi positions. We had an event where aircraft was very sparse. We had a B-52 come on station and say, does anybody have any targets? It was raining that day, so all the Iraqis were in their bunkers. 8-3, Joe Locke's team, who just pinned on one-star general 2 weeks ago, spent about 2 hours plotting all of these positions and transmitted them to the B-52. The B-52 then dropped the ordnance, however many bombs were in a B-52, I think it's like 60, one bomb through the roof of every single bunker. Totally wiped out an entire battalion in one strike. Now, that was extremely lucky, but there's another point to this, and this is the sort of last thing I want to talk about, the PSYOPs component to this. That was a great strike. We killed a lot of people. But we took the opportunity to then transmit messages to the Iraqis and say, one, we did that to that battalion because they killed a woman at a checkpoint yesterday for smuggling gasoline. They poured it on her and lit her on fire. We said, that's punishment for doing that to the civilians. We can kill all of you at any time we want, which was not true. But we said, we're trying to get you guys to capitulate. That's the actual term, because that allows us to turn them around and put them back into the fight. We've sent letters to your commanders. If you think I'm lying, where's your commander? Have you seen him recently? So we started to really use this to seed subversive messages into the regular soldiers, because we knew the officers were not responding and the officers were also fleeing to Syria. Just a couple other quick comments about this. So the way we did this is where Kirkuk is. And basically similar things happen in Mosul, but I'm going to talk more about Kirkuk. We started attacking along the Green Line. We knew from historical experience, cutting the town south of Kirkuk was the first thing you do. We know that because the Kurds told us that's the way they always do it. We did a lot of subversive psychological ops stuff in the town of Kirkuk. Leaflets, radio broadcasts, spray paint that said, Saddam is done, that sort of thing. Doesn't sound like a big deal, but it had a huge effect. 2nd Battalion up here actually did quite a bit of sabotage, cutting rail lines with underground components as well. This is really, really important because what I'm trying to paint here is it's not just about calling close air support and ground attacks. It's the combined effect of underground efforts deep and then surrounding the city at least on 3 sides, trying to make it, I use the description of, have you ever seen a video of like an old construction building like being demolished and falling in on itself? That's what we're trying to do here. We're not trying to just destroy the city. We're trying to make it collapse, but in a controlled way. And that's what we did. And it was through the underground and the multiple guerrilla attacks. The one last thing I'm going to say on this slide, and then I'll start to wrap it up. This is what the typical teams and their guys look like attacking along the Green Line. This is John Halavis. I bring up his picture because when they were assaulting, his Kurdish commander next to him was shot in the head and killed. And when he dropped, John literally did the Fort Benning thing, stood up and shouted, "Follow me," and continued the assault. He made sure the momentum didn't break. Just regarded as, CENTCOM seemed to think that was just regular SF team leader stuff. It's expected of him. The other, I should also point out, that's Sergei standing right there. Kirkuk was the first city seized on April 10th, and it was seized in very, very good condition. Next slide, please. When we seized it, we quickly coordinated with the Kurds to stabilize it. And I can't stress this point enough, that it wasn't just violence. Like, now we had the underground warning people not to blow up oil fields, because we were telling them, we know who you are, you're getting orders from Saddam to blow up the oil field, we know who you are, you will be prosecuted, if not, killed. Everybody came out the day we took the city to now air every possible grievance they've ever had. And I'll just point this out. If Major General Robeson here is, he'd remember this. There was a guy in the crowd waving a giant set of keys like a school principal or a school janitor. When we finally asked that guy, what are you saying? He's like, I run the power plant. We're like, okay. He's like, no, we need to go now because it's going to get looted. We went to the power plant. He literally opened it up and, like the most cartoon-like old-time switches, flipped the switches. The power came back on to probably 80% of the city. And there was a point to that when the power came back on, the intensity of like wanting to kill your neighbors just disappeared. Everybody was totally cool. Life went back to normal. The city was in great, great shape. We eventually got the 173rd to join us in the city. It took a couple of days. There's some other good stories about that I'll relay at another time. The last thing I want to say, this is the part I was going to say, is this is the stuff that will disappoint you. Everything was starting to fall into our favor, and here's the last series of things that were disappointing. When we got into the city, we started wearing U.S. flags, and I'll say with the CIA, when we drove into the city, it looked exactly like the liberation of Paris. Like thousands of people were in the streets cheering. My CIA counterpart jumped out of the vehicle and said, "Hey, come here." He had a box of American flags. I had never thought about this. Literally thousands of small American flags. We ran around handing them out to everyone. So now the optic when you're driving around the streets was hundreds of American flags everywhere. And legitimately, they were excited. The journalists then were keying in on that, and I lied to journalists through the whole city. They're like, "Hey," I would say something like, "You're a journalist. Sergey, bring the vehicles up." And that guy would be like, "Oh my gosh, you're Americans." And we would act like they caught us. And they're like, "What are you doing here?" And we said we were paratroopers. And we said we were part of the paratrooper brigade. "Where did you just come from?" "I came from the airfield." "Oh, they're at the governor's building." And we told everyone there was an American paratrooper brigade in the city. There was not.
Hey, Mark, we're going to have to wrap it.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm sorry I'm going long.
Yeah.
The next day, we shaved our mustaches, put on DCUs to portray ourselves as conventional soldiers, and that's when we got the 173rd in. We wrote a letter to General Ordiano as we were departing, explaining all the things the Kurds had done in an effort to stabilize the relationship, which we were pretty successful in doing. All right, I've gone over on my time. There's plenty more stories I wish I had time to tell you, but I hope that was at least entertaining, if not somewhat interesting for you. I don't know if you have any time for questions, probably not.
Mark, thanks for that. We got time for like half a question. Okay, somebody's got a question in the back. Let's get a microphone in your hand. Choke up on it.
And I'll hang around outside later. You guys can ask me questions offline.
So this is a repeat of the last session's question,
Yeah.
right? A lot of what you talked about to me seems like UW op. Given what you guys did versus what is being either now no longer taught or is being taught differently, what is your opinion with regards to where we need to go as a regiment? Thanks.
Yeah, and you and I talked real brief. I'll say this quickly, and we'll talk later off. The last 20 years has taught us that we're getting too heavy in command and control, and we're losing agility. I was able to do more with 25 to 50 guys than I was with 300-person headquarters. I've watched our procedures over the last 20 years evolve where we just keep getting bigger and bigger, and we think it makes us better, but I don't think it does. And we need to just become more comfortable with doing things with a lower footprint and giving people authority and not having 25 systems of checks. That's my quick answer to your question. All right.
We appreciate it. Mark, thanks a lot. Let me give you a little jiffy thing here. It's our convention coin on a flash. For sale next door.
Thanks so much.
It's our low-cost certificate.
Awesome.
Mark,
Thanks so much.
thank you very much.